inspired, fired up, and on the move. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the places and all the races, arm in arm now, upon our feet. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the schools and all the homes, it's time to take it. It's time to take it to the street.
Gonna get militant up in here. Hello, once again, and welcome, my friends, to this week's episode of The Call, where we call you to direct action. We call you to get involved with advocacy, policy making, just education among your congregants or with your next door neighbors, but taking action to make our world and our communities better places. And so this week we have a guest who we have done work with, over the years, and a very familiar face and name to lots of folks. So our guest this week is Karenna Gore, and she is the founder and the director for the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And a great friend, a great worker, a great lover of the earth and people. And I want to say welcome to the call, Karenna.
Oh, thank you so much, Reverend Woodbury. I'm so happy to be with you. I'm really grateful for the invitation and for all the things that I have learned from you and your community over the years. So it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And a pleasure to have you here. A pleasure to have you in the work, the intersectional work that we do. And that's one place and one point where we come together because we understand the ecology, the biodiversity of the planet that we live on is just not limited to nature, but it's limited to our lives and how we interact with one another. And so just want to get an idea of what intersectional events happened in your life that led you to where you are now and the work that you do now. So you don't mind sharing some of your background with us, it would be great for the audience.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, let's see. My path, I guess I'll try to be brief, but just my childhood was between rural Tennessee and suburban Washington, D.C. My father was in politics and served in government representing Tennessee from when I was 3 years old on. So he was in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then later served in the administration. So my life was informed by many things, of course, but when I think about what led me to this work, the reason why that's relevant is, for one thing, I grew up in sort of two different places, this rural southern place and this Washington, D.C. Kind of pressure cooker fishbowl of politics. And also, he was doing work on what was first called, I suppose, the greenhouse effect, and then global warming, and then climate change, and now climate crisis and climate emergency. The language has changed, but it was something that he was focused on. For myself, I then went on to do various things. I worked as a lawyer, as a writer. I had a path through life that at one point, like many people, had sort of a bumpy road, a kind of a sort of point of reckoning for myself and sort of doing some of that, finding my purpose and regrounding. And at that point, I actually enrolled as a student in Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And so it was there that I actually, through the really transformative educational experience that I received there in theology, learning from social ethics professor Gary Dorian, learning from James Cone, who taught systematic theology, really learning a new way of looking at the world, through the great legacy and the current and the teachers that were there at the time. And so in the wake of that, I actually got a job there. I didn't plan on it. That wasn't my life plan, but I was really happy when that was offered to me. It was a general public programming job. And that was when I went into climate work, because I didn't really see a role for although I was aware of this crisis, I didn't see a role for myself in it necessarily. It wasn't clear to me, but being in the right place at the right time, having those influences that have come through union, really just so rich and powerful all around me. I was able to play a role in convening a conference that we had this was in 2014. It was linked to the United Nations Climate Summit, called by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And I know, Reverend Woodbury, you've been, our paths have crossed around this time as well. You've been a leader in this whole area, so I'm respectful of that as I'm telling this story. I played a role in organizing a conference, and it was to reframe climate change as a moral issue and galvanize faith-based activism around it. And we started the Center for Earth Ethics after that conference. So I've been interested in exploring the moral and spiritual dimensions of the climate crisis, which includes looking at the root causes and not just the effects. And also to really look for practical ways that we can come together to make a better world, not just stop this going off the cliff, but also to address some of these things that are really connected, as you said, the intersectional ways. So my education at Union taught me a lot more than I knew before about racism, about the ways that there's a kind of toxic version of theology that has caused people to behave and society to be organized in a way that's harmful. And so it really was that drove me into this work, and I do view it as the great work of our time, and I'm so happy to be in it with you, Reverend Woodbury. So thank you for the question.
Oh yes, and look, I have to give a shout out to your dad and a shout out to you. And so often we look at the big headlines and we don't know the backstory. And so, your father, Al Gore, is really, everybody talks about President Clinton signing, the executive order on environmental justice in 1994. But that was because he was informed by your father, who, as you said, was really involved in what we call the climate change, what has evolved into the climate change movement. And the work that you were doing, and I have to point this out because when the People's Climate March took place in New York City in 2014, I went to the march, but I did not complete the march because I went to Union Theological Seminary, where an assembly of faith leaders from across the world, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, just across the spectrum, had come together because they did a declaration of faith around climate change the year before Pope Paul, before the Pope wrote his encyclical.
That's right.
But before that, and so those are backstories, and I just want to give a shout out because you were doing that work before the Pope's encyclical came out.
And you too.
Doing that work, huh?
And you too. Thank you for mentioning that. And my father, when he tells that, he always mentions that he was able to work with John Lewis when John Lewis was in the House and he was in the Senate, that they were working on that environmental justice provision, which now, of course, we need to make sure is enforced and expanded. And you've been a real leader in the environmental justice movement, and I know we've all seen in this administration the reason that it's become front and center and been spotlighted is because of that work that you have done and other leaders. So So I give you a shout out as well, and thank you.
Well, thank you. We're in it together, and it takes all of us, all hands on deck, if we're going to change this situation, make a better world. And another thing, talking about what goes on. I met some people that we work with the Black Christian Leaders Coalition. Many of the ministers and faith leaders who are doing work has gone through the center's ministers training program. And so why don't you share some of that, the history of that? And you mentioned James Cone, and you saw me like cheer because he's one of my great liberation theological heroes. And so why don't you talk about the ministers training, how that evolved, where it is today, and where you'd like to go to with it in the future?
Oh, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for contributing to the ministers training, because you have presented at it. You have given I remember very well when you spoke in James Chapel, absolutely brilliant little sermon that I still remember. And part of the purpose of this training is to take mid-career faith leaders and give them the tools that they are asking for. We learn from them as well, of course, that's a big part of it, but to give them tools. So some of it is it's done in partnership with the Climate Reality Project, and so we cover the science and the the science and the policy components of the climate crisis, and then we do explorations of sacred texts and teachings and ritual and ceremony. Roles that faith leaders play, prophetic, like for instance, giving sermons, which you yourself demonstrated so powerfully at that one training I recall, and also pastoral care. A lot of people are dealing with ecological grief and anxiety. This is something we sometimes hear now talked about in the language of psychiatry and psychology, but we all know that this is also the terrain of faith and spiritual leaders, is to guide people through those types of emotions and experiences. And of course, there have been, when it comes to responding to extreme weather events, like strong storms, flooding, droughts, wildfires, there have been faith-based organizations that have historically been at the forefront of providing relief. And so being well aware that that we have in calling together faith leaders, we're dealing with people who are obviously more inclined and skilled in exploring moral and spiritual dimensions, but also have a practical reach. Also have that reach of organizational, often voluntary networks. And we know, unfortunately, because of this situation that we're in, and the recent IPCC report has really highlighted, the Secretary General called it Code Red for Humanity. We know more and more of this is coming. No matter what we do now, but we also know how much more urgent it is to act now. And the role that these faith communities and faith leaders can play is absolutely critical. So we had our first ministers training in 2015. We've had 4 or 5 since then. I say 4 or 5 because we shifted a little into doing regional and smaller scale. And so what we're discerning now, and of course we're all figuring out in COVID time what's next, is whether we want to do smaller versions, whether we want to do virtual, or whether we want to try to go back to what our real cornerstone was, which I think is our preference if we could, which is to have a gathering in person at Union where people can be in fellowship. And so we will definitely be a part of our work going forward. I hope that you will be a part of it in the future as well. And you've brought people, you've recommended people, and we have learned, as I alluded to before, we have learned so much from who comes, because not only do we impart whatever it is that we can to them to help them, we get a lot of information about, for example, why is it difficult for people to preach sermons on climate change? You would think it would be so obvious. It's like an epic biblical topic. However, people will report, especially those that come from communities where it's been so heavily politicized, that that about the discomfort, about the trigger points, about the ways in, about the language that is a barrier, and so on. And so we glean a lot of that kind of information, and also some of the things that are working in terms of practical ways, like growing community garden, growing food, being in solidarity with the environmental justice communities that are nearby, because that touches on that faith teaching of love your neighbor. Yes. And how we can ground it in those faith principles. So thank you for asking. We will be doing more ministers trainings, and it's one of the best things about Center for Earth Ethics.
Great, wonderful, and definitely, we want to be involved in future events with the Center for Earth Ethics. And you touched on a really important aspect in the role that ministers, pastors, Christian leaders need to play. And that people aren't talking very much about the spiritual, the mental, the emotional impacts of people who are suffering through the impacts of climate change, the hurricanes, the floods, the wildfires that are happening every day. And even more important, the pandemic. Yeah. We've had hundreds of thousands of people who have died, and these people are connected to families and friends. And so many people didn't have the opportunity to be at the bedside of a loved one as they transition and said goodbye, or to be at the graveyard, or to be able to gather as a family, as they try to, deal with that heavy emotional weight. And that's something we really, as faith leaders, ministers, as pastors, we really need to reach out to those people. And the people today still, people who, couldn't feed their families, and we were involved with giving out produce. And what we found is that the food chain in this country, the food supply chain in this country and around the world, while, pushing out all this food with corporate farms and industrialization, is really fragile. And that, we saw the cracks in it. And so I know that at the center, you're doing work around food, sustainability, food sovereignty, and doing it as often as you can in a way that is friendly to nature, using indigenous practices, etc. So why don't you share with our audience some of the things that the center is doing around food?
Oh, thank you. Yes, indeed, it's so important. And let me say that as you were talking, I was remembering visiting down in Florence, South Carolina, with your community at Kingdom Living Temple, and the very interesting discussions that were had, which really stayed with me, where elders in your community were sharing about how they remember a time when growing your own food and making your own soap. I remember that specifically. It was knowledge that was held in that community, and it was part of what was passed down through generations. And there was, of course, in many ways, when people are able to have labor saving, devices and more available things in supermarkets and so on, we don't want to discount the ways in which quality of life can improve from that. However, we have a food system now that is making a lot of people sick. And there are big companies that are making a lot of money off of peddling food to people that increases diabetes, obesity, health effects that are really serious, like the term slow violence has been used before about various things, pollution included. It also can go to the food systems, because it's hurting people, and a lot of times people don't have the economic choice to go and get fresh vegetables because it's more expensive, it's more difficult, and so on. But I remember that conversation in Kingdom Living Temple because I recall also that, not only was it about the knowledge that had been passed down, that people were remembering those local food economies being more healthy and robust, but also the abundance, the way that, berries were growing on bushes, and there was a more healthy, and the water was more reliable in wells and so on. So when we talk about ecological degradation, climate impacts, but also the pollution that leads to them, we also are talking about what affects people's food and water. And so I think that local community-based conversation is as powerful as any. But that said, what the Center for Earth Ethics is focused on right now is actually the global scale, because we're based in New York City. We're near the United Nations, and we have a status of observers and contributors to United Nations processes. It took a while to get that. We had to apply, so we're sort of, gratified that having put in that work, we now have that accreditation, including to the United Nations Environment Program. And so we have been convening dialogues that are official side dialogues to the upcoming Food Summit that is happening in the fall. And those dialogues feature Indigenous peoples. They feature faith leaders, people connected to culture, local culture, in a way that that they're lifting up the point that this is not just a commodity for companies to make money off of. Food is nourishing to our bodies. We need to get rid of a system that makes it so that the cheapest option is the least healthy and often even toxic option. And we need to be sure that that we have the health in mind. And we need to be aware of all of the ways in which our food systems contribute to climate impacts as well. Because, you and I both, I know, are sort of focused on that thing of the emissions and the depletion that are driving climate change. And we need to stay focused on it. So there's a lot of emissions that come from land use, and there are a lot of things that go into it. As you've said, using a lot of toxic chemicals in the soil is bad for the health of the food. It's also depleting to the soil, which would otherwise be a carbon sink. So we've convened these dialogues. We're trying to feature these voices. We're going to do an interfaith statement that's in the works right now. And we intend to carry this work forward in a way that we can be a part of changing global food policy for the better, so that we have a global food system that works for the long-term health of the whole instead of short-term profit for the few.
Yes, and when will the summit be held? It's going to be held in New York City? Yes,
I believe that the summit is kind of pared down. It's not going to be a huge featuring a lot of people. With COVID, it's been in flux. And so it's hard for me to give you the exact specifics, but it's going to be in the fall. I believe it's going to be in September, late September, October. We do have an event, and I'll send you on September 2nd. We'll be hosting a panel and a dialogue, which I will be speaking on. My colleague Andrew Schwartz has taken the lead on this work, and he'll be moderating. And so we will send you the links you could share with your viewers, our food dialogues, which we're really proud of, and also an invitation to join us on September 2nd.
Okay, wonderful. Because one of the things we learned during the pandemic, and I've shared this with our audience before on the call, is that we found out that food deserts and food swamps are a myth. They're fake, a fake construct, because they're all based on the fact that we're waiting for some corporation to decide that they want to invest in the community and bring fresh produce. But we found while we were distributing food that by partnering with farmers, we could take food anywhere in any community and distribute it from parking lots and churches and community centers. And so, I'm really glad you're talking about that. And we need to talk to people more about doing their own gardens. And recently we were involved with a project funded by U.S. Climate Action Network along with our good friend, Pete Blue Hawk Paw, who is the chief of the PD Indian tribe. And did a project showing how, with the three sisters that you know about, how to grow food in smaller places, using greenhouses, grow bags. So even if you live in a city with concrete and asphalt, you still can grow your own food. And so that's, that's something that we can do in the States. But how about in other countries? Because you said, the center is working globally through the United Nations. How are you working with people in other countries?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you for lifting up the work that Chief Pete Parr of the PD Indians is doing. We were so happy he came, and I think we probably have you to thank for it, to one of our ministers' trainings at Union. And globally, it's very interesting because the way that these food systems operate, some cultures are experiencing really severe effects of the kind of extractionist mentality. And so we recently, in one of our dialogues, we heard from some people in Bolivia, and there's a part of the Amazon. We hear about the Amazon and the deforestation in the Amazon, and the fires that are part of that. And yes, and a lot of that is actually because of food systems, because there's an incentive for a profit-driven incentive to clear land for soy and cattle primarily. And this, as we know, our ecosystems are fragile. If we align ourselves with nature and if we respect nature, we can get on the side of resilience and work together with nature. But if we continue to try to make war on it, and I say we, like, obviously there's power dynamics, but human society writ large, if we continue to do that, we've already seen what happens. We're going to get more and more of these out of control wildfires and so on. And the Amazon has been called the lungs of the planet. There's so much carbon sink there that it will create a huge imbalance in the world. There's recently a report that it's now emitting more carbon than it's sinking because of what's happening with this. Sometimes it goes under the label development, but not all development is healthy, especially if it's not keeping the health of people and planet in mind. So when you ask about what are we doing globally, we're listening to those voices, we're amplifying those voices, we're lifting up, in this case, when I'm talking about the Bolivian participants, we're saying that this is what it's like to live in a place where the land is being cleared for cattle and soy, and we know that there are, on the other end of that, there are people in tall buildings in, probably a lot of them in Manhattan, where I live right now, making a lot of money. It's really obscene. So we want to be, I hope it's not pretentious to say a prophetic voice. I would say among those truth-telling voices that try to bring clarity. And part of that is amplifying the experiences of the people on the ground, so that then we say to the banks and all of the financial institutions that are funding this, and to consumers, we need to shift away from this. It's now break the glass in case of emergency time. We need to everybody needs to bring what they have to bear on shifting this. And so we're trying to bring that truth out, and we will be working, hopefully, because these conversations include policymakers. So the great hope of the UN, and a lot of people beat up on the UN, but listen, we don't have anything else. We need international cooperation for these problems. This is what we have. And so policymakers, including, I was in a dialogue recently with somebody from the European Union who are making, they're making some decisions about policy, about where they're going to look at supply chains, about, getting very serious about that. And this is the kind of thing that can have a real impact. we're past the point of asking private companies to please, do better. No, we need policies, we need laws, we need big changes now. And so that's what the Center for Earth Ethics wants to work for.
And people need to take action. So a lot of people don't understand about the food chain and how it impacts our environment. So if we have some new listeners or people new to the kind of work you do, that I do, when you talk about people going to the Amazon, going to Brazil and cutting down, thousands, hundreds of acres of trees to remove them from land so that grass can grow, so that cattle can graze, so that we can have our hamburgers, at food chains, McDonald's, Burger King, Five Guys, wherever you want, wherever people go. And they don't understand that the methane that's released by the cattle adds to climate change. And the trees that have been removed, trees actually breathe in carbon and they breathe out oxygen that we need, along with the ocean. They're the lungs of our planet. And so when you remove those trees, they no longer can pull carbon in and store it, what we call carbon sinks. And then we make these hamburgers that have to be shipped using fossil fuels, which means the tractor trailer trucks, etc., are putting more pollutants in the air. And all of this can be reduced just by eating less meat, less beef, so that they cut down fewer trees, and so that the corporations are not making as much money, and policies are being put in place that actually save our planet. And I think a part of that is the fact that there are rights. Indigenous people, people who live with the land, had rights. They had practices that they did, but they also respected the water, the land, the air, the forest as being living entities, as we're a part of nature. And that if you hurt your foot, then the rest of your body, is hurt in some way or another. And not only did they have rites, practices, rituals that they did to honor that, but there's also been some work around where people are actually saying rivers have rights, lakes have rights, mountains have rights, just like human beings, and they should not be abused and exploited. And why don't you talk to some, because I know this at the center, you do a lot of work with indigenous rights and the rights that nature should have.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I do want to talk about that, and I want to circle back, because thank you for that really clear explanation of where we are on the food systems and the role that meat. And I want to just say, it's again where the old timers, the voices of those elders, old timers, that are so important, because it's not as if they didn't eat meat, but it used to be that it was local. It was more normal that it was local, and that you would be coming from a sustainable small scale farm nearby. And so now that everything is wider scale, faster paced, and just as you said, clearing land in the Amazon, all this beef being shipped, it's unnatural. It's putting too much strain on the earth. And so so a lot of times we're well aware that there are forces that are pushing back against our efforts for sustainability, right? And one of the things that they'll say to scare everybody is they're going to tell you can't eat hamburgers anymore, right? And just to clarify, that's not the goal. The goal is to get in right relationship and balance, and go back to where we are connected to our food systems. And again, that is so grounded in the best of our faith teachings. And we can find it, as I know you have, Reverend Woodbury, in the Bible. We can find that wisdom about integrity, about not letting idolatry and false prophets and golden calves and so on lead us astray from what we know to be true and right about how to live. But it is also true that there are indigenous cultures and traditions that have very powerful knowledge, because after all, what makes them indigenous is relationship to place. So the knowledge of actually that energetic orientation to I'm from this place, relating to this land, these trees, this river, this underground spring that has fed my that has nourished my ancestors and will nourish my future generations, is that really sacred connection that can really help people to understand that caring for it is part of the most sacred and righteous thing that you can do. Whereas I think that those of us that come from cultures, for whatever reason, where there's been so much transience, and you know, obviously there's a lot of reckoning going on with the violence of the legacy of what we've wrought here, you know. And I we can unpack that as much as you want, but the point is the indigenous knowledge that has really stayed focused on how you tend to. And when I mentioned that underground spring, I'm thinking because our we have a fellow now with us in our original caretakers program, which is focused on indigenous knowledge, who is very much working with elders who are trying to protect springs. Actually, that underground water, you know, when you think about it, how powerful is it to sit and realize that's from creator, that's from creation. There isn't any company, there's no private sector that gets to claim that as their product. Where's that from? That's from Mother Earth, that's from creator, that's from creation. And we ought to really, really feel how deep that is in terms of a charge to reconnect to that. And so I think in terms of indigenous knowledge on food systems, it's caring for that land with 7 generations ahead in mind. It's not like I'm going to move on someplace else, you know. It's not like amenable to the forces of empire, just making decisions about local land and community. We in this mainstream American culture got so used to that. It's been so toxic and harmful that in a way the role that corporations are playing, and a lot of times in tandem with the government and the state, is like that colonial force. And we need to say, no, local communities are the ones that should be connected to their land and water and food systems. They're the ones that will love it and care for it and protect it. And indigenous knowledge is about, you mentioned 3 sisters before, the corn, beans, and squash. You know, that's traditional knowledge about what grows well together, instead of the monocropping that's all about profit. You know, it's about understanding how the earth and these plants themselves have consciousness. And your question about rights of rivers, you know, we have in our culture, a lot of people have heard about personhood for corporations, that corporations are able to claim to be people. That's unfortunately true. It's how it's come about in our legal system, because of certain cases where a corporation can claim free speech. A corporation can give all this money in the name of free speech. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but let me just wrap this.
No, go ahead.
Okay, just to wrap it up quick. So, so why did we allow that corporate personhood? It has to do with a value system. That was the value system that took hold. Now, in another value system, you can recognize that a river deserves legal standing. A river is a living being. A river, because it carries life. In the indigenous way, it sometimes is seen as an ancestor. It's sometimes seen as a living being itself. You know, we heard from from the Lakota, Dakota Nakota people, the Standing Rock Sioux, when that conflict was happening around the Dakota Access Pipeline. We heard water is life. And so that vision is that we can no longer treat nature as something to be dominated, extracted from, objectified. We have to recognize that it has a right to exist. And one thing about that is when we do that, it's better for the people that, first of all, it's better for future generations because it's a long-term view. You're taking care of what they're going to inherit, as opposed to just squandering it all. And it's better for those that live closest to the land, that actually, the people that are going to be swimming in a river when it's hot outside are not the people that have a private pool, right? It's taking care of what is a common good. And so I really believe in the rights of nature. I really believe it as a way forward. I think that the current environmental laws are inadequate to deal with the onslaught, and that we have to shift gears in order to protect our natural world.
Yes, and I encourage you to continue to keep talking. One, because we have plenty of time. Two, also because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever that a corporation is treated as a person. But because a corporation isn't a living, breathing thing, maybe the people who own shares of stock in it or the people who are employed by it, but it's not a living thing. I mean, it's something that's created on paper,
Yeah.
that's recognized by other pieces of paper. But because corporations are viewed as persons, they actually have purchased rights to bodies of water. And so,
Yeah.
that some of our bottling companies, they
Thank
actually
you.
purchase ponds and lakes and streams and and as you said, our sources of water come from two places. It comes from rainwater, it comes from the aquifer, the water that's under the ground, and of course our oceans. But all of that is interconnected. And so it is amazing how can something on paper can be treated as a human being, but the actual living thing like water and soil and trees and foliage, where scientists can actually look under a microscope and tell you that there are living cells here, that these are living beings scientifically, but our political system refuses to do that. And so a little bit more about, what you know about the fact that, that there have been organizations and people who have been fighting to have our waters and our land actually being treated and as living beings. If you can share some more with our audience about it, because that's what actually. You can't put a corporation under a microscope and prove that it has life, but you can prove that water is living and the air is, that all of them are composed of living things.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Those are such great insights from you as always. It's important to look back also and remember uh, property. People were treated as property. There was no homicide of a slave. There was a property damage. I mean, as obscene and horrible and painful as that is, women, children also considered property in many different times in history. And when there was a shift that was made in seeing that, let's just go with the example of a child. That in fact a father can't just kill his child if he wants to, that the state has an interest in protecting the life of that child. It's not just property. That was a shift of values. And it doesn't mean that the child can speak for themselves in court, but it means that it's worth it for us as people in collective self-government to figure out how to designate a guardian, so that child has legal standing and protection and is not treated as property. The same way we ought to do that for underground aquifers, for rivers, for forests, for mountains. These are not, we can't just see this as property. We're living on a finite, we have a planet that has boundaries. And we've seen the pace and scale of industrialization. We've seen the consolidation of corporate power and wealth and the partnership with government. We've also incidentally seen the population rise from 1948, 2.7 billion to about, I think, 7.8 billion or something today, and still going up. And increasingly the resources are being depleted at a much faster rate than they can be replenished. So we have to change this. And I think that it makes sense to listen to those organizations and those voices, which have in many cases been led by indigenous knowledge, because of the reasons we discussed, because of the legacy of that worldview and thought system, that all of this is living, that all of it is sacred, that, you know, as the Lakota saying, Mitaki Oyasin, all my relations, that all of life is related. The teaching of 7 generations, every important decision made today should keep 7 generations in mind. So there are different alliances in the rights of nature movement. You know how this is, there's always politics in every movement. So I hesitate to give the names of the different organizations and so on, but you can look at the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. You can look at movement rights at the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, CEDAR, at Center for Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF, Earth Law Center. These are some of the organizations that I know that are working on this, and they all are paying attention to the importance of indigenous leadership. They're all paying attention to the relationship to environmental justice, because we have to make sure. Some people worry, and I think this is a very important point. You know, there has been a dehumanization of people, right? So we don't want to discount that when people are still fighting to be within the circle of human dignity, of a moral concern for human beings. We don't want them to feel that suddenly rights of nature means, oh, it doesn't even matter anymore. You know, of course, human rights are human rights. River rights are different. They're river rights. It's not to take away from human rights. So these are all really important questions to be addressed. And the one that you raised about property, you know, treating nature as property, you can buy a mountain and blow the top off of it, you know, and the only thing that can stop you sometimes is, like, maybe there's the Endangered Species Act. So there's one endangered species, and then we focus on what that endangered species is in order to stop the deforestation and then people claim, oh, environmentalists only care about that little bird. That's not it. It's that's the only tool that we have sometimes. And so we have to switch our laws to be in accord with our values, so that we can protect what is truly valuable for all people and for future generations.
Absolutely. And we talked about water, and most of our planet consists of water, and most of our bodies consist of water. So, you know, let's talk a little bit more about what this center has been doing around water issues. What are you working on?
Oh, thank you. So we have a senior fellow, Mona Palaka. She is of Hopi, Havasupai, and Tewa descent. Grew up right on the Colorado River. Has been working on water issues her whole life. And she is she's one of the founding members of something called the Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers. She's been in touch with particularly women elders around the world, and the knowledge and connection to water that they have. And she is going to convene a traditional dialogue about Indigenous water ethics in September. And we hope to build a curriculum out of that, so that we can start to give more people the opportunity to learn from that knowledge, because it's important to be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and with their sovereignty. But it's also a time in which we need to learn, all of us, that there's, you know, in some people talk about new technologies are going to save us from climate crisis. But actually, it's ancient wisdom that's oftentimes even more powerful. And you can look at some of these things as technologies, actually, you know, ritual and ceremony, in the sense that it can bring communities together it can pass on values through generations. That's powerful. So if you build your culture in a way that does that around a spring, a river, you're going to have a next generation of people that that care about that and that protect it. And that's going to mean that people have clean drinking water, that it's more guaranteed. And so that's our goal with the Indigenous water ethics and the curriculum and education, that hopefully will come out of that. And there are others that are obviously working on that. We're always interested in learning more about who's working on that. So to all your viewers that want to contact us and send us, you can do info@centerforearthethics.org, and we love to learn more.
Great, great. And this is a very good time to raise water issues, because of what's happening with our oceans, with the coral reefs dying, with the plastic, the pollution, with what's happening with climate impacts, with the sustained heat that's impacting the Colorado River and Lake Mead, and even now the Hoover Dam is not able to provide the water that's necessary at the rate that it should to generate electricity. And they're actually talking about perhaps restricting the amount of water that farmers can use and that people can drink. And so I think this is a great time. And that's just in the United States, but around the world, we have serious water issues where people, have to walk for miles to get water that's clean to drink.
Yes, absolutely. And can I mention one other thing? So you and I, Reverend Woodbury, have fought pipelines together, including the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was a great victory. But there's this build out, even in this time with climate impacts, and even knowing all we know, and even with the increasing availability and affordability and viability of clean renewable energy, there's still this push to build out fossil fuels for the and it's just one of these it's so frustrating, but what we see is that when local communities push back, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but it is a righteous and important and powerful point of conflict in this time to push back. And even in the times like in Standing Rock, where the Dakota Access Pipeline ended up getting built, it's still in play that it might get shut back down. And all those efforts make a difference, and they show and they shine a light to others. And I just want to highlight the Byhalia Pipeline in Memphis, because this was a really incredible thing that happened. There was an oil pipeline that was planned to go through Southwest Memphis, which is I think 97%, some vast majority Black neighborhood, and already beset, as we know, is the pattern, tragically, in this country of racism, whereby all toxic facilities are often located in Black and okay. So this pipeline, Byhalia, a partnership of Valero and Plains All American, two fossil fuel companies, was going to go through Southwest Memphis, and the community. And here's the thing: what made me remember to mention this is that not only was it going to go through this community already dealing with 4 times the national rate of I believe it's cancer, as well as higher rates of asthma, and I can check those numbers, but let's just say definitely at least double the rate of those diseases, right? Okay, it was also going to go right over an underground aquifer, the Memphis Sand Aquifer, that provides all of the water to the city. And so this had been fast tracked because of something called Nationwide Permit 12, which has been also used on other tar sands pipelines, and Line 3 needs to be defeated as well. This other pipeline going through Minnesota. Okay. Yeah, but the point is, it had been fast tracked so that the madness of this, that they would even consider putting a high pressure oil pipeline right over an underground aquifer, just goes to everything we've been talking about. which is that we do not value, we have been blind to the things that are most valuable. And that includes that underground water aquifer. So it was this community, this Black community of Memphis, with the tenacious organizing and advocacy that defeated this pipeline. And this just happened. And so it didn't get as much attention in the national news as Line 3. They hadn't started construction. What ended up happening is that the companies pulled the money finally, because they just too much trouble.
Much opposition.
Too much opposition. You know, of course, they didn't quite admit that, but that's the reason why. And so I just want to say that because it's a point of hope. There's absolutely no way, if it hadn't been for every ounce of energy, passion, and hard work that came from the community, Memphis community against the pipeline, in particular as the organization, that would have been built. That underground aquifer would have been put in major jeopardy, people's drinking water. And so people are rising and speaking, and we have to be, you know, the work that we do at Center for Earth Ethics, the work I know you do, Reverend Woodbury, is to be there in support of those communities and to try to lift up those voices and to try to make a difference that way. And so we have to really celebrate these victories when they happen, and then look around and keep going.
Yes, yeah. And I want to suggest something that you might want to share, and all of those in our audience might want to share. There is a huge movement to build pipelines all over this country using what they call natural gas or tar sands. What we know is unnatural sand, and we know that it's frack gas that is causing problems with people's drinking water in areas where they're extracting it. My suggestion is, and I've been sharing this with a lot of people, is that rather than fighting these pipelines one at a time, these offshore oil polluters one at a time, that we should just come up with a general cry, which is that we oppose the expansion of all extractive, dirty energy industries, all of them, all pipelines, all these fossil fuel polluters, and we support all clean, renewable energy generation industries. Because one of the things is we're having these amazing victories, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the one in Memphis, fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline now in Line 3. But what we really need to do is educate and make people aware that all of these are bad. These are just bad ideas. And perhaps that way, just like we did with fossil fuels, with coal, we can have people say, hey, we don't want this. We don't want it expanded. And then we don't have to tax communities to fight them one at a time. So just a suggestion. But we have a few minutes left. And so I want you to, just kind of close out with your ask. Because, being involved in a lot of social actions and rallies and marches and all of that, always share with people that if we don't have particular ask, and if we don't ask people to perform particular tasks, then any gathering that we have has just been a wonderful social event and social gathering, but it doesn't help with organizing. And so I want you to share just some of your asks, people attending the summit, ministers training, what's your ask for our listeners, things that they can do, and then tell people how they can reach you and others at the Center for Earth Ethics.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I think people need to contact their local elected officials and raise the issue of the climate crisis. I think they need to say, what are you doing about this? We are in and that can go at city, state, and national, federal level. But there are our elected officials are often focused on short term, and they care about their popularity and they care about their reelection. And if they're not hearing from you that this is a priority, they just focus on the short term. So we have insane decisions being made right now, like to continue on developing out fossil fuel infrastructure. It's not a fringe position to say that we should stop all new fossil fuel projects. The International Energy Association, actually, which is not at all a liberal progressive outfit, they came out and said, look, if you want to stick with the goals of the Paris Agreement, all countries must stop all fossil fuel projects. So the United States of America is very much included in that. So that's a fossil fuel thing. The regenerative agriculture is another piece of it. But just to make it simple, because I don't know where everybody's coming from who's tuning in here, if I would say the time for don't it's good to do your own consumer choices. It's good to promote people living better lifestyles. But at this point, we need policy. We need government to act. We can't let them make it think it's everybody's fault and point fingers at each other for not recycling enough. We're way past that. We need new laws, and we need big changes. So I would say contact your local elected representatives, ask those questions. What are you doing? Look at that summary if you can, or if you want to read the whole report, go for it, of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and just say, I've read, this is code red for humanity. What are we doing? What's the plan? Mm-hmm. So that's one ask. Specifically, if you happen to be in Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, and you can help fight the Mountain Valley Pipeline, that's one that we really need to get canceled. It's tearing up the landscape. It's putting environmental injustice on, as usual, communities with less income, communities of color. So we need to fight that. I would love to have anybody contact us or sign up for our newsletter, because that way you can see what's on our radar. Join us for our food and faith work, and we'll have some convenings on some of these other projects as well. And so please go to centerforearthethics.org, sign up for our newsletter. We would really love to stay connected, and then you'll see opportunities to join us virtually or hopefully sometime in person. And I really hope to meet you all. And thanks for tuning in.
Thank you so much. And I really look forward to when the time comes when we can see each other face to face again at Union Theological Seminary and help you continue your great and awesome work. So to our audience, we want to say thank you to Karenna Gore, the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics in New York City, and encourage her to keep up the good work and to understanding the intersectionality of things, and regardless of the work that you're doing, hey, when you can tie in with the center, it'll be great. I do it, and you should too. So this concludes this week's episode of The Call. As always, if you want to contact us, you can do so by emailing us at New Alpha Community Development Corporation or going to our website, newalphacdc.com. And so until next week this time, stay strong, stay engaged. Let's make change, policy, education, direct action, any way that you can, because it's up to you. It's code red for humanity. But if we work hard, we can have a green planet and a green future soon. So until next week, take care and stay blessed. Until we meet you again on The Call.
From all the places and all the races,